So now we're going to do our pop method. I'm going to start out by comparing this to a singly linked list. So if you'll recall from singly linked lists, to move tail to the left was an O of N, because you're moving tail to the left when all of the arrows are pointing to the right. So in order to do that, you had to start at the head and iterate through the entire list to get to this point. But with a doubly linked list, we don't have this problem. We do have arrows pointing to the left, so this is going to be much simpler with a doubly linked list. Now let's walk through the steps to pop that item off the end. So the first thing, since we're going to return it, we need to have a variable pointing to it that we'll call temp. And the next step is to move tail over, and we just say tail equals tail dot previous, and that's going to move that over. Then we need to break the connection between the two arrows that are between that 7 and 4 node. So the first one will say tail dot next is none. That breaks that one. And then we'll say temp dot previous equals none, and that breaks that off. And then we can return temp. We do have a couple of edge cases here, one for if we only have one node in the list, and another one for when we don't have any nodes in the list. Okay, so those are the steps. If you want to try to code this, go ahead and pause it here. Otherwise, I will get into the code. And we will code for this situation first when we don't have any items in our doubly linked list. So we'll say pop, and we'll say if the length is 0, we're going to return none. So let's remove this code. And now let's look at if we have 2 or more items. First, we'll create that temp variable. Temp equals self.tail, like that. So we'll say tail equals tail.previous, and that moves that over. Then we'll say tail.next is none, and that breaks that connection. And we'll say temp.previous is none, and it breaks that connection. And then we'll decrement the length by 1. So let's look at this in with the rest of our code like this. So if you'll recall from the pop method in singly linked lists, we had an edge case for if we had one item in the list and we popped that off. And we're going to handle it with this code here. I'm not going to walk through all of the detail here because we walked through this in detail in that video for pop in singly linked lists. But we're going to say if the length is 0, we need to set head and tail to none. And this is the length being set equal to 0 after we decrement it here. And then we will return temp. So this is very similar to the code that we wrote for singly linked lists for pop. And I walked through the code in a particular order in that video because I wanted to teach particular things. But in this video, what I want to do is clean this code up. The problem I have with this code is we have if self.length is equal to 0 here, and then we have it again down here. And yes, this one is after we decrement the length by 1, but this is not as readable as it could be. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this if statement and everything inside of it, and I'm going to move it up. In order to do that, I'm first going to remove 5 lines of code out of this, and I will bring all 5 lines back in a moment. We're just going to rearrange this. So first I'm going to remove those 5 lines of code, and when I move this up, because this does represent the situation where you start with one item, I'm going to change that 0 in the if statement to a 1. Then I'm going to say else, and we have these 3 steps again, and decrementing the length, and returning temp. So those are our 5 lines of code that I've brought back. But let's look at how much more readable this is now. This is if we have 0 items. This is if we have 1 item. Then this is for 2 or more items. There is one line of code that I've added here, and that's actually the else, and that's it. So now let's take this code here and change it back to the way it was. It is exactly the same lines of code, just rearranged and much easier to read. So we're going to look at this code in a moment in VS Code, and we will create this linked list. And this allows us to test all 3 of our scenarios to see if we can pop an item off of a list with 2 or more items, and we'll pop that off, and then see if it works with a list with 1 item, and then we'll run it again to see if it works when we don't have any items in the linked list. Okay, so let's flip over to VS Code. And there is our pop method there, and this is where we create our doubly linked list with the items 1 and 2. And this is where we print that out. So let's just run this. And you can see up here that this returns 1 and 2. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to scroll up, and I'm going to take this print statement here, this print list. I'm going to remove this, and I'm going to paste in these lines of code. So all we're doing here is running pop 3 different times. We're running it for when we have 2 items, and for 1 item, and then for 0 items. All right, so let's run this. So that's going to return 2 nodes and then finally return none. And as we have done before, to test this, I'm going to say return temp.value instead of returning the entire node, and run this again. And that returns 2, 1, and none, which is exactly what we're looking for. And then always remember to come back up after you've tested it, remove value, so it just returns temp because you want it to return the entire node. So it looks like we have a working method for pop.